things can work out the way they work out, and people are in the place they are, and we can't go back. But just from a purely removed standpoint of diagnosing what's going on with your culture, planning to wait until your mid to late 30s to start having children and waiting then to give birth literally makes you developmentally delayed.
Welcome to the Whose Body Is It podcast. I'm your host, Isabella Malvin. For those who don't know me, I'm a life coach, a hypnotist, a former birth worker, and a former liberal feminist turned radical truth teller. On this podcast, you'll learn about the ideologies, industries, and technologies attempting to control our minds and bodies, such as transgender ideology, pornography, prostitution, and the many tentacles of the medical industrial complex. Together, we'll untangle patriarchal lies as you listen to jaw-dropping interviews with women from around the world. Warning: while listening to this podcast, you might find yourself triggered or perhaps notice where you've been biting your tongue on the issues that matter most to you. In the masterclasses available on my site, as well as my one-on-one coaching and hypnosis, you will learn to stop getting triggered by every freaking thing, learn to cultivate resilience, gain knowledge, and if we're working together one-on-one, stop unwanted behaviors and increase your self-confidence. You can book your first session and check out the masterclasses in the library at whosebodyisit.com. And I just want to say that it's because of your endless support that I'm able to interview amazing women, get their stories out, and produce regular content for you. So with that being said, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. And if you're just listening in, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and consider making a financial contribution via the link in my show notes. You can also support the podcast by getting your activist stickers. So my pro-woman stickers have the power to intercept transhumanist programming. So take a photo of your stickers out in the wild and tag me on Instagram at Whose Body Is It. Without further ado, let's get into this week's story. Okay, so Mary Lou Singleton is back. I believe this is your third time on the Whose Body Is It podcast. I'm so excited to get into today's topics, which include renormalizing, starting childbearing early, as well as getting married early. We're going to be talking about tradwife culture and a lot more. So these are the kind of conversations that I'm having amongst my friends in their 30s and in their 40s. And this conversation that you and I have had, Mary Lou, and I love your perspective on this issue. So thank you for being bringing us the wisdom in this realm, because I think we really, I personally need it, and I think a lot of other women need it too. So let's start with the early childbearing. Like, what is the strongest case that you have for encouraging women in their 20s to have babies?
First, I want to say that what we're calling early childbearing, or starting your family, starting to have babies in your 20s, is historically delayed childbearing. So I really want to point that out first. I am a big proponent of renormalizing starting childbearing in your 20s for multiple reasons. The primary one being the health and safety of women and babies. It's interesting that we are such a safety obsessed culture, as we witnessed during the phenomenon we call COVID. That was a really fascinating time to observe just how obsessed people were with safety and how risk averse the Western culture is, especially American culture, where, you know, what I was observing was here in the United States. People were single-mindedly focused on health, safety, and medical safety. But no one is applying that lens to childbearing right now. We have simultaneously completely normalized high-risk births. Techno-medical hell births are the norm for, I would say, over 90% of women in the United States. Would you agree with that? Do you think it's probably that high?
For sure.
Right?
For sure.
Right. And we've normalized having a baby in the neonatal intensive care unit. We've normalized breastfeeding not going well. We have normalized childhood illness. People almost, you know, brag about their, you know, all of their pathology in the realm of reproduction. And it makes no sense in the broader culture. And I know that part of our suffering right now comes from wanting things to make sense and be a cohesive narrative. And that's a whole other topic. But for a risk averse, health obsessed, you know, terrified of death culture, it makes no sense to tell women to wait till their mid to late 30s to start childbearing. Birth goes best, you know, when you start in your 20s. Just statistically, I'm not saying that women can't have good births in their 30s or 40s. I've seen it many, many times. But statistically, pregnancies are healthier, births are more straightforward. You're much more likely to pull off an unmedicated physiological birth. The children are healthier, breastfeeding goes better if you start younger. So that would be my first explanation of why women should really aim to start having their families before they turn 30. They should aim to start childbearing before then. And then, as a healthcare provider who does a lot of pediatric care, and a witness to humanity, I think that youth is the best time to do these bold, enormous, adventuresome acts. And I think that the boldness of youth, of someone who is before, you know, their late 20s, we talk about how, oh, your frontal lobe isn't developed yet, so you shouldn't make any big decisions. But honestly, that the flip side of that is that time of life is when we are bold and adventuresome, and we want to climb Everest, and we're willing to sail across the world, and we can have a bring it on attitude about childbirth and child rearing and not be afraid of this enormous cliff we're jumping off of. I think that that's actually ideal for starting parenthood, rather than waiting till we're very rigid and solidified in our sense of self and become more quote unquote rational, looking for reasons for why we're doing things rather than following our impulses like we do in youth. I think that being a younger parent makes someone a less neurotic parent and a more instinct-led parent most of the time.
That makes so much sense. And you had said something to me. You had said children used to be something that we conceived in the body, and now we conceive children in the mind. And I've thought about that so many times since you shared that really insightful. It's like it just nails it. Like it is so true. There are a million reasons to not that we can come up with to not have a child at a certain time. Things can always be more ideal, except for age. Like that is one thing that we just completely lose control over, right? It's like we can delay and have more money, but you can never reverse the passing of time. And we know that obviously IVF is all a big scam and a lie, but it sells us that it's like a perfect match for the culture of I can wait because I can actually pause. We're not going to get into IVF and surrogacy in this episode. We cover that in another episode. So if you're new to that topic, go to my episode archive and you'll find tons of content around that. But you had also mentioned like the role of the grandparents, which I think is also a really good case. Can you expand on, the benefits of early childbearing in relation to like the other generations of the family?
Right. There's quite a bit of anthropological theory and evidence that grandmothers have played a large role in the evolution of the human species, and that there is a huge health and longevity and developmental advantage to having active grandparents in the lives of children. And what's happening is, if people delay childbearing to their late 30s and their parents have delayed childbearing until their late 30s, people are losing that experience of having a vibrant, healthy, functional grandparent role, grandmother in particular, role in their lives. And that is a big evolutionary shift for humanity. And I do want to back up and talk about my own biases here. For one, I describe myself as an old soul turning into an old lady, right? So I'm just seeing this, I'm observing what's happening, and I'm old enough to have been the first generation of women where this hoodwinking took place, where we were convinced that being a mother was not something to aspire to, that if you were a high IQ woman or a middle class woman or upper class woman, you should aspire for a career over childbearing. Childbearing was secondary. And that having your first child before getting your career established was a low class, undesirable phenomenon. So my generation is the first to have experienced that. I'm also, because I am that generation, I'm old enough to have witnessed what people were rebelling against. I come from an Irish Catholic family, and I witnessed a lot of women who had more children than they wanted, who had no control over their reproduction. I understand why this seemed like a good idea. I understand the good intentions behind some of it. I think it got co-opted by larger economic forces. This really wasn't an entirely women's liberation phenomenon of convincing us all to diss motherhood and to think that anyone telling us that motherhood was a worthy life goal was just trying to oppress us. I don't think that was entirely coming from the women's liberation movement. So I've watched this current and I've seen what's happened. And then also in my own family, my parents were both the youngest children of large families. So their parents were in their 40s when they were born. And then my parents delayed childbearing. They didn't meet each other till the late 30s. So they were in their 40s when we were born. So I lived that life of no grandparents that I now see as becoming the norm for children. And I also lived the life of, my brother and sister and I had both buried both our parents before any of us turned 30, which is going to become much more common. And we're going to be seeing a lot more only children in their 30s caring for elderly and frail parents. That's a new phenomenon as well. So these are factors to consider when you're making these decisions about your childbearing.
Yeah, and if you're an only child, it's like a double whammy. It's like your parents had you in their mid 30s, maybe late 30s, maybe early 40s. You start to have kids in your late 30s, and then you have small children, and then one, possibly two elderly parents that might even live in two different states. Like just geographically speaking, like the best case scenario, at least you're all in the same town, but that's really unusual. I'd say as far as like the US goes, it's really unusual for everyone to kind of be in the same place with the rates of divorce and yeah, just like the normalizing kids going to college in different states and then that shaping their politics and their outlooks and then wanting to settle in that region. And yeah, it's a complicated. Yeah, when I'm an only child, and my mom had me when she was 30, almost 34, 35 when she had me. And now I'm facing like, okay, well, I'm going to be in that situation when I have small children. My mom is really healthy, thank God, but like, she's nearly 70. Yeah, it's really tricky. The grandparent thing, like anytime I brought that up to friends, like it is like completely like what like they have not thought about it. Like it is just this perpetual, no, I can wait, no, I have time, no, I can wait, no, I can have time. Because also we're in the culture where it's like I can get everything delivered. Like, I don't
Mhm.
need that help. I can outsource it. Like, I don't actually need my parents there, or I don't have a great relationship with my parents, or I don't even see my parents being a factor in being with me postpartum or with my children, So there's already that disconnect, perhaps, where everything just seems really figure outable because of the like convenience culture and the normalizing postpartum doulas and
Mhm.
baby nurses and yeah, supplementing the lack the loss of the village or the intergenerational living. On that tangent, like where do you find the balance? Like there's a lot of like the trad wife kind of culture. And I honestly think it's really fake trad wife culture. Like anyone who's on Instagram who's claiming to be a trad wife is actually probably a network marketing influencer entrepreneur going online and showing your whole life about your trad wife life just shows me that you're not actually a trad wife. You're a mother. You're mostly working in the home and you're like a full-time content creator. Like it's not that's not a traditional stay at home like what? That's just it's not do you agree? Like that's it's just not it. Like if you were an actual traditional stay at home mom wife, you wouldn't be also
Having to,
online
I know, right? Having the job. Um,
having a job. Yeah.
right. We live in very interesting times, and it's really difficult to determine what reality is in so many places, right? Anywhere you look, it's like what's actually happening. The destruction of community means we don't actually get to witness very many families in a community. It's changed a lot. Many people consider the online world to be their primary social life right now, and that's concerning to me, and it is hard to know what's really happening, and we've seen again and again and again that movie stars and influencers who are portraying an image of their life are actually not living the life that they're portraying, right? So
Mm.
I think that influencer culture is not what we should be looking toward to see what's actually creating good outcomes health wise for families and women and children. I'm blessed to have lived in a community for since my early 20s, being rooted in the same place and have gotten to witness many, many lives. I'm blessed to be in a place of my children are grown and they very gently give me feedback about my own parenting choices, and that I have to try to be gentle with myself about the way I raised my kids. And I did have my kids in daycare, and then my husband was the stay-at-home parent after they were small. He did most of the homeschooling and hung out with them. I had a busy career as a midwife. I don't regret any of that, and I can see now how it would have benefited my children for me to spend more time with them when they were younger, and especially my son, but both of them, for me to have been more actively involved in their lives. Again, I come from this brainwashing of the 70s and 80s where I was singled out literally by a pediatrician before I was even in kindergarten as a high IQ kid. I was put in a preschool for the gifted. I was in gifted from kindergarten on. And the messaging was, you're more than a mother. Anyone telling you that you should stay home with your children is robbing not just you, but society of your intellectual gifts. I remember in a gifted class in ninth grade when we went around the room and the teacher asked everyone what they essentially wanted to be when they grew up. And one woman said she wanted to be a mother. She wanted to stay home with kids, and everyone shamed her. The entire class of students horrified, shamed her. The teacher shamed her. It was brought up for the next 4 years in a mocking way that she had dared to express that her life goal was to be a stay-at-home mom. It was very denigrated as a career path. And at the same time, it was elevated by patriarchal men as women's only role in life, the men who were fighting the social changes that were happening with women's liberation and the economic co-optation of that. We're not presenting stay-at-home motherhood as an empowering choice for women. It was, this is your God-given role, and if you step out of it, it's an abomination, and you're a sinner. And you're only good for breeding and you're only good for hanging out with small children because women are inferior. So that was the messaging when I was growing up. I don't know what the messaging is now, because we live in a time of almost infinite media sources, right? So there is no cohesive narrative and everybody's getting a different narrative. But I do want to point out that that's where Generation X is coming from. That's what happened to us in our minds as young women, that we were really shamed out of thinking motherhood was a worthy goal. And we're told that daycare was a liberation, even though there were many, many studies that showed children do best when their mother stays home with them in the home for at least the first 5 years of life. My stomach almost turns when I say it, because I have to overcome so much programming to say it out loud. The same with, we do have stacks of evidence that children do best in a 2-parent home, and that divorce harms children. My stomach churns when I think, oh, I'm enabling the Vatican and the right-wing Christian men when I admit that that's true. But again, as an old soul turning into an old lady, I can look back and see what the consequences were of these social changes. And I think we need to discuss that in a nuanced way.
Well, in terms of like the messaging, yeah, it's so varied across the US, but I noticed a really stark difference between New York City, like where I lived till I was pretty much like 27, 28, like the friends that I had there, the women that I met there, versus the women that I was meeting and was in community with in Texas. And they were the women in Texas, and this was like Austin. This wasn't like some rural area with a small population. This was like Austin, I would say. And not everyone was from the state of Texas, but the culture that I was exposed to, even in a blue city like Austin, women were having children younger. They were already married. It was very unusual that I was both unmarried and without a child. Now I knew a lot of single moms as well. It's not like everyone was in this like full family unit. The single moms that I knew had probably had their first when they were like 25 or something. But I was the anomaly. Whereas if you and I'm going to be 33. And if you take the groups of women that I grew up with in New York, even my college friends, I went to university in Rhode Island, so it's like whatever, same Northeast. Only a handful of them are even married right now. Really, really different messaging just based on like the state. And my mom's family is from Texas, and I definitely grew up with the narrative like, whoa, they're getting married way too young. Like, whoa, they're having kids way too young. Like, they don't know. Like, they don't have the opportunities that I have. Like, my mom escaped and moved to New York and like gave me private education, and like how lucky am I to like, and I always thought when I was a child, like, oh, my mom had me around 34, 35. Whatever my mom did, add a couple years because progress.
Mm-hmm.
Progress.
Right. Right. And what are we progressing toward? To start with, it's an unsustainable culture, because so few of those people end up having more than one child. Many people who come from that urban, delayed adolescence presented as sophisticated adulthood. Um, they're not reproducing at a replacement level for themselves. So there's that to look at. It's not a sustainable plan for society to tell young women that's the way to go. And then there is that issue that I just mentioned, that people are being hoodwinked into believing they're getting to know themselves better, or they are more responsible by delaying childbearing. But really, childbirth is a rite of passage. Reproduction is a rite of passage. And through a lot of human history for the last 6,000 to 10,000 years, getting married is a rite of passage, right? That this is something that you make a lifelong commitment a legal and spiritual religious commitment that you're going to stay with this person and household with this person and become one family with this person and raise your children in the context of that relationship. That is an enormous rite of passage. Similar, like it's bigger than joining the military. It's bigger than going to graduate school. It is a bigger commitment than nearly anything. Maybe becoming a rabbi or a priest is a bigger commitment, a soul commitment or something. But marriage used to be a true rite of passage. Childbirth absolutely is a true rite of passage. You do have a lifelong commitment to your child. It is a natural rite of passage that I believe most of the other rites of passage of adulthood are modeled on. And it turns you into a more mature organism if it unfolds properly in a, in an ideal situation, which I think could happen at least 90% of the time if the culture supported that. And instead of allowing that to happen, we have all of these developmentally stunted women and men thinking that they're doing it the better way. And I would argue, and it sounds so judgmental, and I know life is not ideal and things can work out the way they work out, and people are in the place they are, and we can't go back. But just from a purely removed standpoint of diagnosing what's going on with your culture, planning to wait until your mid to late 30s to start having children and waiting then to give birth literally makes you developmentally delayed. We're not meant to wait that long.
I 100% feel that. I see that. I feel it. It feels like total misalignment. Like I was talking to a friend about this. Like I'm starting to get little white hairs in the front, and I know that I would have a different relationship to it if I were married with children.
Yes.
But the fact that I have, like, I have a streak that I got when I was a child, so I don't count that. But like the ones that are coming in now, I'm like, whoa, this is mismatched. Like this is not like my life isn't supposed to look like this when this happens. Like it's supposed to be. So it's not just the gray hair. It's the fact that yeah, it feels misaligned with the because I haven't gone through those initiations like that you're talking about. So one thing that I see with women around my age and older is like an inability to share. Like when in relationship, I also had this in a relationship where it was like, whoa, we're just learning to share like children because we've been living
Right.
alone for so long. And you also have a great insight. The it's easier to be a startup than a merger.
Right. Yes. So then not being able to share, a lot of that comes from the culture of only children or even only two children. Two children don't have to share as much as five children do. That's been an enormous shift in our demographics. I noticed that as a young woman when the few times I had a roommate who was an only child, it was a very different dynamic than having a roommate who'd had siblings. I would notice a lot in my friendships, even my generation. I came from a town where there were very few only children. Often the only children were adopted or from families where there'd been kind of a medical problem, or they were definitely Protestants, or they weren't. I didn't see a lot of it in the Catholic community I grew up in. So again, my perspective was very much colored by that. And then I got to college and then young adulthood, and it was very clear to me that only children were a lot more likely to participate in the behavior we now call canceling. They didn't have a lot of conflict resolution skills. When you grow up with siblings, you learn every day of your childhood, you can be at each other's throats, fighting so hard, and you got to sit down to dinner and you got to wake up again tomorrow morning and live together as siblings again. You understand conflict resolution in a very different way than if you've never had to do that on a daily basis through your childhood.
Yeah.
So we've lost that as well. So, okay, so many different things. So yeah, the not sharing, the gray hairs. I have to say, like, letting my gray come in I call it my silver hair, but it really is my gray hair, has been buffered by becoming a grandmother at almost exactly the same time that started to accelerate. And anytime I get distressed about the visible aging process going on in my body, I can step back and think, I'm a grandma. Grandmas are supposed to look like this. Like this is fine. I am no longer in the pool of reproductive age women trying to entice a mate to breed with, right? Or whatever we want to say. Like I'm not in that place in my life. I am in a place where, yeah, my silver hair is a wisdom sign and my body is different, and I'm not supposed to be portraying a sexually reproductive vibe right now. And it's okay for this to be happening to my body. Where I see a lot of my friends who are not grandmothers, who probably will never be, or their children will wait a long time to do it, seem to struggle more with the aging signs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're out of sync with our design. We're out of sync with our development. Okay, yeah. And then, okay, so the question had been before, like the trad wife thing. And I think people should ignore influencer culture and just sit with their own lineage and sit with, like, let go of those labels of trad wife and just sit, well, what would be ideal for me to bring children into this world and nourish them well, rather than have these labels. And I do think women who have this physiological desire to give birth and to mother, who have an undisturbed birth and therefore an undisturbed entry into breastfeeding and an unmedicalized reproductive experience, are more likely to want to be with their children. They're really bonded with their infants, right? And they want to spend time with them, and they feel physically out of sorts when they're away from their children for extended periods of time. And there will always be women who are not as domestic as others. There will always be women who don't sit well with little children. And that's where community comes in. And it's really important to be friends with women who have the house where any woman can come by with her kids and just get support. And I was blessed to be in a community of young moms when my children were young, and we all kind of found our way with that. I was one of the few women who did work. I was a midwife, and the other women understood that was important work. I didn't have a corporate job. I wasn't clocking in 9 to 5, but the other women helped me when I just needed to drop my kids off and I needed to do clinic, or I needed, I was tired because I'd been at 3 births that week. And I have to say, I'm not the temperament. I wasn't well suited at the time for just being present with my children. And I'm sad about that. And a lot of that comes from my own trauma and the brainwashing I just told you about. But I was really blessed to have a community that could buffer some of that. And then my children were in daycare, and I kind of wish that they hadn't been to the extent that they were. But I think that over 90% of women, if their children arise from the natural baby fever that usually shows up between 20 and 28, this overwhelming desire to have a baby, if you're not on pharmaceutical birth control and you're a heterosexual woman and you're wanting to be a mother, that baby fever is a natural part of our species. And if the babies come out of that and you have an unmedicalized pregnancy and birth and your breastfeeding's going well, the continuation of that is to want to be home with your children and to have another one when the baby fever sets in again. And this is all an ideal world, but that's what most people are aspiring to when they're making these choices. So let's just lay it out that most women do want to be with their children when they're young. Does that make someone a trad wife? I'm not sure. I think it just makes you a mammalian mother in a species that requires a lot of care for the first 7 years of our children's lives.
I love that. Just bringing it back to the basics, like we're just mammals. This is the same conversation around like the body hair, which is going to be a separate episode with my friend Danielle. But that we're living in so many layers of distortion that, just with a woman who gets pregnant, who is presented with her supposed options, has to do so much unlearning and deprogramming just to get to the physiologic option, which would be left alone, would just happen, right? But
Right,
to get to the
right.
thing that would just happen, she has to clear out so much junk. And yeah, and it makes so much sense in the culture of disconnecting mother baby through pregnancy, or like just the disembodiment process from puberty on. If you've been on birth control and then you're pregnant and then you're being surveilled and then you have your conventional hospital birth and you never like come online with your baby, then it makes perfect sense to be in that continuum of separation and disconnection. So it's a lot to recover. One thing that I feel so grateful for in my own like maidenhood is having witnessed so many families like in their homes for thousands of hours, witnessing what works, what doesn't work, what I would love to see in my life, what I would really feel sad about happening to me if it did. Like and then being friends with women who have many kids who are making it work. It's very unusual. I think my experience of having like seen so many families, young families for the past like 8 years, and watching mothers who genuinely love to be mothers, like love to be home with their children and love to breastfeed and are embodied and free birth. Like it's so not typical of the culture. And the average, like the women that I would just meet out and about, like are terrified of birth, like in not meeting them in the
Yeah.
context of radical feminist circles or birth culture, but just the wave that most 32-year-old women are on now is the birth control, like coming out of the birth control programming. Like it's not
Hmm.
even at, and maybe that's also the delay, of course, which is that a lot of women are recovering their bodies. Right.
Right,
Like from like may not actually be even able to conceive at this moment in their reproductive
right,
health journey.
right. There, and you can't fully recover. It's like puberty blockers. The birth control blocks a natural process. The birth control has stolen yourself, part of yourself from you. You can't ever recover that. You can heal in the place and the time stream you are now, but we will never know what your development would have been if it hadn't been chemically blocked, if you hadn't been chemically neutered during that time. And part of what got blocked is the baby fever of the early 20s, right?
Right.
That is such a common phenomenon. And part of what got blocked is appropriate mate selection, where we know, even, I'm not big on leaning on the science right now, but we do know there are studies that show that women choose completely different men when they're on birth control, and we've seen it in our own lives,
Yeah.
and we've seen it in our communities that birth control changes women. Hormonal birth control. It's crazy that's I'll ask people, what are you using for birth control, and they'll say, oh, nothing. I'm like, well, how are you avoiding conception? And they say, oh, we're using a combination of condoms, fertility awareness, and withdrawal. It's like that is birth control. Like that's,
Hmm.
that is avoiding. But the word birth control means hormonal birth control right now,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. There's so much to unpack. And then before birth control culture, the industrialization of birth and how that hoodwinked women and how it separated us from women's culture and from our own creative power of creating humanity. Babies became an industrial product that was delivered by the hospital, that male doctors and the medical system and the the hospital delivered babies, and women shifted in their mindset, and the culture shifted in the mindset from women understanding the seamless progression of the mothering that is pregnancy, the mothering that is childbirth, and the mothering of having your newborn in your arms with the cord still attached where you're one but two, and then the mother of the placental delivery, and then into the mothering of being two. That
Mhm.
seamless progression of when I became your mother turned into when I brought you home from the hospital, as when motherhood begins.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
we are so messed up. We are so completely messed up now. But I do believe we have it in ourselves to remember how to be an organism. And those of us who've been harmed by the hoodwinking and now can't go back and do it another way can express to younger women, to women in their teens, women in their early 20s, that there are a lot of problems to the way this has been set up for us. And there are a lot of problems with the fact this has been sold to us as liberation when really it's harming us. And there are many benefits to starting your family young. And here is what we have witnessed, and these are the reasons why. One of the things with daycare too is when you tell a woman to wait until her career is established to have children, she has often set up a lifestyle that requires the income that comes from her career, and she can't stay home with her children.
It's a vicious cycle. Oh my gosh. It's so crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It's nuts.
And as much as we tell ourselves when we're young and poor that, oh, whenever I'm making more money, I'm going to stay at this lifestyle and I'm just going to save it all. Hardly anyone does that. It's not the way it works. We all, our financial obligations expand as our income expands, and we become dependent on that level of money coming in. And many women don't have a choice but to put the baby in daycare at 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, much earlier than they would physically want to as a mammalian mother.
Right.
And that creates a bonding block where if you have to put this baby in daycare at 6 weeks, you're going to bond very differently than if you're not even thinking about that. You're just in the moment of being with your baby.
Right, right. And I saw just with the pumping prep, it's like as soon as baby's home from the hospital, I got to start pumping. I have to build up a reserve because I'm going back to work in 12 weeks. And I didn't know the baby was going to be in the NICU for 2 weeks. And so now it's only 10 weeks. And it's like, yeah, it's those 12 weeks. If they're lucky, quote, lucky enough to get the 12 weeks, are completely consumed by preparing to leave the baby. I mean, I did so many test runs with postpartum moms where and the babies would just go on like eating strikes because mom would leave. I remember one time this mom left for maybe 8 hours, say like 6 to 8 hours, and my job was to introduce the bottle, or the theory they thought that the baby might take the bottle from me because they wouldn't take it from the mom because the boob was right there, obviously, and the baby just went on a food strike. Like the baby was like, I'm not freaking putting this plastic bottle in my mouth. Where's my mom? And she waited till her mom got home. But then mom did go back to work and the baby did take bottles. So yeah, it's everyone needs to take a mandatory mammal class. Like just remembering that how mammals function, that we are mammals, watching some animals give birth in the wild.
I know so many people are convinced that we're the only species that doesn't actually have instincts, that we don't have. We don't know what to do. We can't give birth without massive technological information intervention. We need experts telling us how to care for our children. We're going to kill our babies if we sleep with them. All of this insanity. It's very hard for women right now. But I do want to say again that this is more evidence of why it's best to start this when you're still in the rebelliousness of youth and you don't trust adults because they've given you false information or they haven't been letting you decide for yourself. And I do think the younger a woman is, the more likely she is to say, screw it to authority and to be willing to do something bold and rebellious. And that becomes a lot harder when you're in your 30s and you already have been literally indoctrinated. If you have a doctorate or an MD, like you've already been through college where you're sophisticated and you learned to feel self-congratulatory by joining this system and parroting these beliefs and being part of this belief system. And it's much harder to start questioning anything because you're entrenched in it and you're a part of that system.
Yeah.
And so then we get back to okay, what do we do? Because the men are all messed up now too. And, birth control culture has or contraceptive culture has made men completely irresponsible, or they feel like they can just ejaculate freely in whatever woman they want, and they don't feel any obligation to her. Where my generation was still at the tail end of things like shotgun weddings, where if you got her pregnant, the men in her family will kill you if you don't stand up and do the right thing and marry her and be the dad. Yeah.
I love it.
It's not that long ago. That's not that long ago.
So awesome. It's so awesome.
Yeah. So, and it wasn't all great. There were the Magdalene homes and the homes for the unwed mothers. And there was a lot of coerced and forced adoption. I'm not saying things were perfect. I'm just saying we have a different kind of bad right now. It's not working. What can we go back and kind of dig through the wreckage of, maybe we threw out too much. Maybe there's maybe those social norms were developed to protect us, not just to oppress us and harm us. So men no longer have any sense of personal obligation to women that they're having sex with. They have no sense that having sex with women creates babies. They, if she gets pregnant, she was irresponsible for not being on the pill or having an IUD, right? It's not his fault. And they have no, honestly, they have like less love for women, I think. And as much as it pains me to say this, I think daycare culture and the loss of the stay-at-home mother and divorce culture has created more seething resentment toward women in men than
who had
than
moms
we admitted.
who were okay.
Yeah. Whose mom was their whole world and loved being with them all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm not blaming the women. This is like, these are bigger cultural factors at work than any individual can claim power over. But I think that that's one of the other cultural forces is we have a lot more men who just hate women and don't like their own mothers, don't even know their own mothers. Were never like, they were only with their mother from 6 o'clock until bedtime, and then this rush in the morning to get to daycare. They weren't mothered.
Yeah, or blame the mother for the absence of the father.
Yes, that happens a lot. That's happening a lot. So we're in a mess. So how do you find a nice guy? See, mothers, like, raise your boys to want to be fathers, to want to be good papas, to talk about good papas, talk about the species in nature where there are good papas. The men and the whole like alpha culture and stuff, like they like to literally lionize the species that are terrible fathers, like the lions, but they're plenty, like, lions are terrible fathers. They're just like, there's like not great examples for men to try to live up to. So talk about the eagles, talk about the wolves, where there's an alpha pair. There's not an alpha male that oppresses the females and wolves. There's an alpha pair that it models leadership for the pack. They're not oppressing the pack. But wolves mate for life, coyotes mate for life. Those are cool species. Eagles, many birds, so when your kids are little and they love animals and they are still connected to their own animal being, if you are not in a situation where there is a papa, find a way to get past your own reactions and your own defensivenesses about that. If you are raising sons, raise them to be a good papa. And it's okay. It doesn't mean anything except you want to raise your boys to be good fathers, whether or not there's a good father involved in their life. We have to get creative about that. And raise your boys to love women, breastfeed as long as possible. Just cuddle your boys. It's a good thing that little boys are in love with their mothers. And then they'll go off and look for a woman that reminds them of their mother. Don't coddle them, make them have chores. No, you don't want to raise them to be looking for a mother, but they want to raise them to be looking for someone who's going to be a good mother for their children. I'm looking at my own reactions here, Isabella, of my own training. Oh, you're being so heteronormative.
Oh my gosh. But
right?
That's also mammalian.
Exactly.
Heteronormativity is mammalian.
Yeah, human reproduction
is heteronormative.
Yeah, it's heteronormative, exactly. And that's okay. And we should not be normalizing artificial reproduction and and transhumanist, uh, just the whole transhumanist agenda. It's okay to be heteronormative in when we're talking about this. And if it doesn't resonate for people who are listening, and if it's causing triggers for people who are not heterosexual and who are not looking for a long-term partner and who even just vehemently disagree with what I'm saying, that's fine. You can turn it off right now. But if you're a woman or a man trying to heal what's happened to us and looking at how to find a lifelong loving mate and to be in a lifelong loving relationship to create a container for your children, which will then create a container for your grandchildren. If you're wanting that Russian nesting doll lineage, let's keep talking.
Oh, I love the practical advice for the mothers who are single moms raising boys. Like I love that, like exposing the children to the animals that they already are interested in and showing them how it's possible. I love it. I love all your practical suggestions and insight. My last question is, what are the kinds of conversations you think women who are on a timeline, like who are in their mid to late 30s, maybe even early 40s, who are searching for a mate, like what do you think those conversations, what kind of conversations do you think women should be having in the early stages of dating who are trying to make up for lost time?
I think people who want a lifelong commitment and are looking to have children with someone should only date people who are also looking for the same thing. There's the whole date for marriage movement. And I actually think that's a good idea at whatever age you're at. Maybe not teenagers, that's a whole different situation. But once you're in your 20s, I think people should be dating for long term. I think it's been terrible for us to create this culture that of casual sexuality and no commitment to each other and not bonding with each other. I think pair
Yeah.
bonding happens in our species. So I think only dating men who are also looking for a long-term commitment, who also want to get married. There are different, we're in the times we're in, but there are different ways to do that. There are different dating apps if you're in that world. My sister in her 30s found her spouse through a Catholic matchmaker,
Love
and
it.
who has an incredible track record of
Mm,
long-term marriages. Coming from Catholicism and people who are devout Catholics, there is a lower rate of divorce in that culture because getting divorced is a mortal sin. You'll go to hell. It's a culture that very much values marriage, but the Jewish tradition of the Yenta predates Catholicism by thousands of years, right? That's within the Jewish community. Even if you're just culturally Jewish, I would recommend like go to a Yenta, pay a matchmaker
hmm
who has a good track record.
hmm
Get involved in communities where there are men who are looking for marriage. And then really putting down all the superficiality, all the Sex in the City brainwashing of perfection, and he needs to be rich and physically attractive and like he's got to be perfect, and sit with is he good enough? It's okay to settle. It really is, as long as you have your list of what you won't settle on. And
hmm
I've just met so many women who are in their late 30s who are still looking for Mr. Right, who are so fixated on looks. And I think that is absolutely ridiculous, because the one thing you're going to attract a man who's also fixated on looks. And do you want that pressure when you're having children? And do you want that pressure as you're aging? It's a terrible thing to be fixated on. I'm not saying like someone should be, it's okay if they're physically repulsive to you, but we would like, are you pheromonally attracted? Are
Right.
you like, does he make you laugh? Does he make you feel comfortable? Do you feel safe with him? Is all much more important than the way he looks.
Yeah.
And I think
100%.
putting that down, like putting down the superficiality, putting down like the fashion stuff, and make your list of what your absolute requirements are. For me, it would be is he kind and respectful? Does he have long-term friendships, or is he someone who's, does he have a track record of being someone who builds community rather than destroys it? Whatever your the way of determining if someone's a
Mm.
good person. What's
Mm.
his relationship with his family? This is another hard one to talk about, because in my youth, I was very estranged from my family. And I would get very upset when my parents would tell us, when you're looking for a mate, look at how he treats his family. How he treats his family is how he's going to treat you when you're his family. And, and that, I don't think that's bad advice. Every once in a while,
Mm.
you'll find someone who's comes from a lot of dysfunction, who has done a ton of work to overcome that. But if he's still actively hostile and playing like mind games with his family, like, you probably want to avoid that stuff, like,
Mm.
is he able, like, how is he with family? Because you are going to become his family and your children are going to be his family. These old pieces of advice that used to be given to couples when they were courting, there's often a lot of strong protective wisdom in those. Is he honest? Like, is he honest? Is he, I think, kind, honest, able, like, good at conflict resolution, even if he's from a really dysfunctional family, is he able to be peaceful in that situation, and
Mm.
not constantly be, and reacting and doing the work in ourselves, so we also are this. So I think really looking for someone healthy who wants a
Yeah.
long-term commitment and who has the same goals and who's willing to reproduce quickly in the, like, I think, wait, like, if you're already in your mid-30s, don't wait years and years, like, yeah,
No.
it's okay. Our species, every one of us has, until recently, an uninterrupted lineage of people getting the hots for each other, getting married quickly, and having kids quickly. Like, it's okay. It's okay,
Yeah.
as long as the filtering has been done, that this person's not dangerous and this
Right.
person is willing to make a lifelong commitment.
Right. Amazing. No, it's very good advice. I'm just taking it all in. Okay, yeah, next time, Isabella. Next time. No, I'm just
It's really hard because we are really messed up right now, and
yeah.
it's not any of us as an individual. We're sick as a species.
I'd been thinking about recently just the how common it is for women to be living alone. Like you're in your mid 30s, you're not married yet. Chances are you've made some strides in a career, like you've increased your income hopefully with every year and you can afford to live alone. And so you do because you can afford it now. And you're like
Mhm.
roommates is something for, like in your youth, right? But then you're living alone and it's not biological. And then you're starved for physical affection. It actually makes a lot more sense to me that women are getting into physical relationships like sooner than they should.
Well, and then there's also hookup culture too. But yes,
Well, there's
everyone
hookup
is.
culture, yeah, and you don't have, if you had a roommate, if you're living at home, you might question whether like you maybe you can't really have someone over or someone you'll have to answer to someone if you do stay, if you do more hookup culture. I mean, I guess it's not. I think this is my point that living alone creates unique vulnerability, like loneliness and
Mm,
desperation to jumping into physical relationships like before the emotional intimacy is even established, before you know that the person is safe. Just
right.
because we want like a hug or
I
like
know.
it's a really bad place to be.
It's a hard time. And I see what's happening with, just segue back to like trad culture and women joining conservative religious traditions. I can understand the reactivity that's driving
Yeah.
women into that, because it's a really hard time. Yeah, and living alone also makes it harder to then live with somebody else, because you're set in your ways and
Yeah.
you have a harder time sharing and relaxing around each other and letting things be a jumble of a mess as you're finding your way together. It's created a lot of issues. I think about, I used to do a lot of births for the old order Mennonite community here. And again, they have their problems. It's not perfection. But when I look at what are some things that work really well in that culture, there's a culture that very much values marriage and family. The things that I see that I think were really wise in that culture were the way the women the older women helped the younger women choose mates. And what I heard again and again of the married women with children telling their younger sisters and their younger cousins was, see how he is around children. Bring him to my house where there are 5 kids.
Yes.
And do not marry him if he can't handle playing with 5 kids for an hour.
Love it. Oh, that's great. I love
and
that.
There was one case of, I would hear the women talking about there was an unhappy marriage, and they would just tut and shake their heads and say, she married for looks. You don't marry for looks. She didn't pay attention to how he doesn't like kids. She married because he was the best looking man. And he, of course, knew, like, the women were clear about it. They were like, he knew he didn't have to try any harder than that because he was so physically beautiful. And she thought she was getting lucky. And here she is with a man who doesn't like kids, and she has to do it all herself. And he comes home from work and doesn't enjoy spending time with the kids, and he doesn't help. And it's like, do not marry for looks. How is he with children? And then they would say, how does he treat his sisters? And interview his sisters. If he's fighting with his sisters all the time, he might not be like the best guy around women,
Right.
But if his sisters all vouch for him, that's worthy. Now we're again in this culture of only children, or people who might just have one sister, one sibling. That's a subculture that still works on the old rules of 5 as an average size number of children. They work on the old ways, but I think that piece of how is he around kids is good. If you know somebody with 3 or more kids and you're dating a guy and wondering what his marriage potential is, go hang out at her house and see how he is around her kids.
That's great. I love that. That's a great advice. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much, Mary Lou. I know this is going to be very insightful and practically very useful for women in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, and older for them to share with their daughters and granddaughters too. We'll have to do another episode in 10 years on this very topic and see where we're at. Maybe at the 5-year mark, we can revisit and see what has shifted in the culture, how our birth rates are going, or because I'm hoping that there's going to be a back to the old when we realize that, like, just like as you said, it literally doesn't even work to be able to replace the species, like this.
Right. I really hope we can do it in a way that isn't just a reproduction of patriarchy, and that we could do it in a way that honors women as the creators of humanity, and helps men step into their power as protectors and being in service to women and children, rather than little kings in their household. I worry we're just going to swing right back to that. I have a friend who, he's he's an indigenous Mexican man, and the way he described the male-female polarity in a household is the woman is the fire, she's the hearth, and the man has to keep feeding the fire. It's his job to make sure, they chop the wood and keep feeding the fire, and then everyone is warm and fed. Everyone is blessed by that. So as long as he keeps feeding the fire, he is warm and fed, and all of his children are warm and fed. And I think that place of honoring women as literally the creative center of the household in a way that doesn't denigrate men, but honors their separate role as the maintainers of the safety and the container, and the physical providers of the fuel that keeps the woman burning.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or family member who needs to hear this content. And if you do share it on social media, don't forget to follow and tag me at Whose Body Is It? So until next time.